A group of bikers picked the wrong woman to mess with at a quiet gas station, taunting and blocking her path, unaware of who she is. What they don't know? Her son is watching. And when Big Shaq steps inside, the entire gas station goes silent. No threats, no fists, just his presence, and a lesson these bikers will never forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet roadside gas station. The midday heat shimmered off the pavement as Shaquille O'Neal pulled her car up to pump number 4. She moved with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, her hands steady as she unscrewed the gas cap. Her thoughts were elsewhere, perhaps on the errands she needed to run or the family she always worried about. The station wasn't particularly busy, just a few cars parked near the convenience store. Inside, a tired-looking cashier flipped through a magazine behind the counter, barely glancing up as customers drifted in and out. It was the kind of place where people didn't stay longer than necessary, just a stop along the road, a moment in transit. As Lucille filled her tank, the deep, guttural rumble of motorcycles split through the stillness. 4 bikers rolled into the lot, their exhaust pipes growling like thunder. They weren't in any hurry. They parked haphazardly near the entrance, their leather jackets and tattered jeans a sharp contrast to the stillness of the afternoon. Lucille didn't look up. She didn't need to. She had seen men like them before, the kind that liked to make noise, to take up space, to remind everyone they were there. She replaced the gas nozzle and turned toward the store, reaching into her purse for her wallet. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, offering a sharp contrast to the heat outside. The cashier barely acknowledged her as she made her way to the cold drinks. She reached for a bottle of water just as the door swung open behind her. The bikers entered like they owned the place, their presence swallowing up the small store. The tallest of them, scruffy beard, deep-set eyes, and a sneer that looked permanent, grinned as he spotted Lucille. He nudged the man beside him, whispering something that made them both chuckle. Lucille ignored them. She had no time for foolishness. She walked to the counter, placing the water and a pack of gum on the register. The cashier, a young man who looked barely out of high school, scanned her items quickly, his eyes darting nervously toward the bikers. $2.75, he muttered. Lucille pulled a $5 bill from her purse. As she handed it over, one of the bikers whistled low and slow. Well, ain't every day we see a lady like you around here, the tall one said, his voice oozing condescension. Lucille didn't respond. She reached for her change, slipping it into her purse with practiced calm. Another biker, younger but no less cocky, leaned against the counter. Where you headed, ma'am? Bet you got somewhere real important to be. Lucille turned to leave. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Just as she stepped toward the door, one of them moved, just slightly, just enough to block her path. He wasn't touching her. Not quite. But the message was clear. Now hold on, the bearded one drawled, his grin widening. Ain't no rush, is there? Lucille met his gaze. Her face was calm, unreadable. Step aside, she said, her voice low but firm. For a moment, no one moved. The cashier looked down, pretending not to notice. The air felt heavier, the cold hum of the AC suddenly not so comforting. The younger biker chuckled, nudging his friend. Feisty one. Outside, unseen by them all, Shaquille O'Neal sat in his car, watching everything. He had arrived just minutes ago, parking a few spaces down. He wasn't in a hurry, just taking his time, scrolling through his phone, sipping from a bottle of water. He had no reason to be on alert, until he saw his mother go inside and the bikers follow. Shaq knew his mother. She was strong, proud, and never one to back down from anyone. But he also knew the world wasn't always kind to people like her. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he watched the scene unfold through the window. Back inside, Lucille didn't back down. She didn't flinch. She simply stared at the man in front of her, her silence louder than any argument. The bearded biker clicked his tongue, then, slowly, deliberately, stepped aside. "Have a nice day, ma'am," he said, mockingly tipping an invisible hat. Lucille didn't acknowledge him. She walked past, her back straight, her step steady. The moment she stepped outside, she felt the weight of her son's presence. Shaq was already out of his car, standing near the gas pumps, his massive frame casting a shadow over the pavement. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Lucille sighed, shaking her head. "You saw all that?" Shaq nodded. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. "I handled it," she said. A slow exhale. A small nod. But Shaq's eyes never left the store, because the bikers were still inside, and they hadn't learned their lesson yet. Shaquille O'Neal stood by his car, his massive frame partially hidden by the shadows cast by the gas station's awning. His hood was up, his hands tucked into his pockets, his sharp eyes locked onto the scene inside. He didn't move, didn't rush in. Not yet. Years of discipline had taught him patience, had instilled in him the power of waiting. Inside the gas station, his mother stood with her back straight, her hands steady, but Shaq knew her well enough to recognize the slight tension in her shoulders. The bikers, oblivious to his presence, were still circling like vultures, their arrogance filling the small store like a bad stench. Shaq took a slow breath, steadying himself. His mother had always told him, "Your strength isn't in your fists, son. It's in your control. The moment you react out of anger, you've already lost." He had lived by those words. On the court, in life, in moments like these. But patience had its limits. The tall, bearded biker, who seemed to be their leader, grinned as he took a step closer to Lucille. His voice was slick with condescension. "You know, you don't look like you belong around here. What brings you to our fine little town?" Lucille didn't answer. She simply bent down to pick up her bag from the counter, ready to leave. The biker's boot moved before she could react. With a calculated nudge, he kicked her bag off the counter, sending it tumbling to the floor, spilling her belongings across the dirty tiles. Her wallet, keys, phone, all scattered at her feet. The gas station fell into complete silence. The young cashier stiffened, but still didn't speak. His nervous glance flickered toward the bikers, then toward Lucille. He wanted no part of this. Lucille inhaled slowly, her face impassive, her pride refusing to let her flinch. She bent down to collect her things, methodically, one by one. The bikers laughed, a low, mean sound that crawled under the skin. Outside, Shaq's fingers clenched into fists inside his pockets. Another memory flashed through his mind. His mother at the kitchen table, telling him stories about how she fought to raise him, about the people who had underestimated her, the ones who had spoken down to her like she was nothing. And now, here she was, once again, standing alone against men who thought they were untouchable. Shaq exhaled. Not today. He pulled back his hood, letting his face become fully visible. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped toward the store. Inside, Lucille rose to her full height, her gaze unwavering as she met the bearded biker's eyes. She wasn't intimidated, but she was tired. The biker smirked. "You seem a little quiet, lady. We just playing around. No need to get all serious." Lucille didn't speak. She didn't have to. The gas station clerk, young, afraid, and clearly regretful, made a small, almost imperceptible motion toward her. It was nothing more than a flick of his eyes and a shift in his stance, but it was an unspoken apology. He wouldn't stand up for her, but at least he knew he should have. The air inside felt thicker now, heavier. And then, before anyone could react, the entrance bell chimed. Shaq stepped inside. The moment his 6'11" frame filled the doorway, everything changed. The laughter stopped. The cocky smirks faltered. The bearded biker's expression froze mid-taunt, his eyes widening just slightly before he forced himself to smirk again. He didn't recognize Shaq at first, not fully. He only saw a massive man, his presence alone shifting the entire dynamic of the room. The other bikers exchanged quick, uncertain glances. They weren't scared yet, but they were aware. Lucille turned, her eyes meeting her son's. For a fraction of a second, Shaq saw something unspoken there. A warning, a message. "I don't need saving, but I won't stop you either." Shaq didn't look at the bikers immediately. He walked past them, slow and deliberate, like they weren't even there. He crouched down beside his mother's bag and began picking up the scattered belongings, placing them back inside with care, Not a single word spoken. The gas station clerk swallowed hard, his hands twitching on the counter. The bearded biker forced a chuckle. Well, well, he drawled, trying to reclaim the moment. Who's this big fella? Shaq didn't respond. He simply stood up, his full height now towering over every single man in the room. The bearded biker's smirk twitched at the edges. His confidence cracked, just slightly. Shaq's voice was calm, deep, unshaken. You knocked something over, he said. Pick it up. Silence. The younger biker shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between his leader and Shaq. The power dynamic had shifted. The bearded biker let out a short, forced laugh. Man, we were just having a little fun. I didn't ask, Shaq interrupted, his voice still steady. I said, pick it up. The bearded biker's smirk was gone now. He glanced at the others, as if expecting them to jump in, but none of them did. The young biker, the one who had laughed the loudest earlier, suddenly wasn't laughing anymore. His hands were jammed into his pockets, his shoulders tense. The cashier, sensing a shift, inched ever so slightly away from the counter, as if he didn't want to be part of whatever was about to happen next. The bearded biker swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, and then, with a slow, stiff movement, he bent down. He picked up the last remaining item from the floor, a small bottle of lotion that had rolled under a shelf. He set it back on the counter. Lucille gave Shaq a look, one that only a mother could give a son. She hadn't needed him to intervene, but she wasn't upset that he had. Shaq turned to the cashier. She paid for her stuff? The kid nodded quickly. Shaq took the bag from the counter and handed it to his mother. Then, just as slowly as he had walked in, he turned and walked out. Lucille followed, her posture still straight, still unbreakable. The bikers stood frozen in place, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. And as the door swung shut behind them, no one dared to say another word. The gas station door creaked as it swung shut behind Lucille, but the sound of her exit did nothing to break the tension inside. The air still felt thick, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the hostility. The bearded biker, Wade, stood in the center of the store, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter. His smirk had returned, but now there was something else behind it. A bruised ego. His pride had taken a hit. He didn't like the way things had just played out. He didn't like the way the air had shifted when that towering man had walked in. He especially didn't like the fact that, for a moment, he had hesitated. The rest of his crew was quiet now, their earlier bravado dampened by the reality of the moment. They had walked into this store expecting easy entertainment, but things had taken a turn they hadn't anticipated. Wade wasn't about to let it end like that. His boots scuffed against the tile as he took a step toward the door, watching through the glass as Lucille approached her car. Something about her composure, about the way she carried herself, made his blood boil. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was strength. And Wade had always hated strong people who didn't know their place. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. I don't see what she's so proud of. One of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling. Another cleared his throat as if to suggest it was time to let it go. But Wade had already made up his mind. He wasn't finished. You know, he continued, loud enough for Lucille to hear through the door. Some people just don't belong in certain places. Ain't got nothing to do with rules. It's just the way things work. Lucille, just a step from her car, stopped. She didn't turn around, didn't give him the satisfaction, but her shoulders squared, just slightly. Wade chuckled, taking another step toward the door. She's a little old to be acting tough, don't you think? He mused, his voice dripping with mockery. Age catches up to all of us, except some of us never had much to start with. Still, Lucille didn't react. She had spent a lifetime brushing off words like these. She had fought her battles, weathered her storms. There was nothing this man could say that she hadn't already heard before. But then she felt it, a slight tremble in her hands. She clenched them into fists to stop it, swallowing down the anger that threatened to rise. She had learned long ago that dignity was her greatest weapon. But sometimes, dignity was heavy. Inside, one of the customers, a middle-aged man in a crisp button-down, had just entered, his eyes locked onto his phone. He barely noticed the scene unfolding as he moved toward the refrigerators in the back. But then he heard Wade's words, caught the sharpness in his tone, saw the biker's postures, and he turned around. For a moment it seemed like he might say something. He stood there, gripping his phone a little tighter, his eyes darting between Lucille and the group of men inside. And then, just as quickly as he had looked up, he looked away. Without a word, without so much as a pause, he turned on his heel and walked out. Lucille heard the retreating footsteps. She didn't turn to see who it was. She already knew what had happened. She had seen it before, the weight of indifference, of knowing that some people would always choose comfort over confrontation. A slow exhale. She reached for her car door, refusing to give them anything. Wade smirked. "That's right. Just keep walking. That's all people like you are good at." Walking away. The smirk didn't last long, because at that exact moment, a shadow moved across the pavement. Wade didn't notice it at first, too caught up in his own voice. But the younger biker, the one who had started to feel uneasy, did. His eyes lifted, tracking a shape that had shifted from the far end of the lot. Something massive, something approaching. And then, finally, Wade noticed it too. The gas station door swung open with a quiet click, and Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside. He moved with measured ease, not in a hurry, not making a show of himself, but making his presence known. The bikers may not have fully recognized him before, but now, under the glow of the fluorescent lights, under the sheer weight of his presence, there was no mistaking who he was. 7 feet of silent, unshakable power. Wade's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Just a fraction. But it was enough. Shaq's steps were slow, deliberate. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Lucille finally turned, her eyes meeting her son's. There was no surprise there. She had known somehow that he wouldn't just sit in that car and watch. He stopped a few feet away from the group, his gaze never leaving Wade's. No expression, no anger, just presence. And suddenly, Wade's voice wasn't as steady as it had been before. "Well now," Wade said, forcing a smirk, trying to recover. "Didn't realize we had a celebrity in our presence." Silence. Shaq didn't blink, didn't move. Wade let out a short, awkward laugh. "You here to protect Mommy? That's sweet." Shaq's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, deep, and absolute. "I'm here," he said, "to see if you're done talking yet." The entire store seemed to shrink around them. The cashier stopped breathing. The younger biker shifted, glancing toward the door like he wanted to be anywhere but here. And for the first time, Wade, the loudest man in the room, had nothing to say. Because when words cut deep, silence cuts deeper. Shaquille O'Neal moved through the gas station with the kind of presence that didn't need an introduction. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't rushing in like some hero in a movie. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately, as if he were just another customer stepping in to grab a drink. The bikers didn't notice him at first. They were still too busy basking in their own cruelty, still feeding off the weight of their words. Wade, their leader, leaned against the counter, a self-satisfied smirk curling at the edge of his lips. He was comfortable, settled into the role he played so well. The man who dictated who belonged and who didn't. Lucille, still poised, still unshaken, stood her ground. But even the strongest people grew tired. Shaq stepped forward, moving past the rows of snacks and cold drinks, his towering frame casting a long shadow under the humming fluorescent lights. He didn't have to push his way through. People moved out of instinct when someone like him entered a space. Wade was still laughing, still playing up his role, when Shaq finally stopped, right next to his mother. The shift was instant. The bikers might not have recognized him right away, but they recognized the change in the air, the unspoken weight of something bigger than them, something they couldn't control. Lucille didn't look at her son, but she felt him beside her. A silent wall, a presence that had always been her greatest source of pride. Shaq's voice was calm when he finally spoke, so deep it seemed to settle in the walls themselves. "Is there a problem here?" Silence. The kind of silence that isn't just an absence of noise, but a presence of realization. The younger bikers shifted, glancing at each other as if trying to gauge how they should react. Wade, however, refused to acknowledge the shift. He let out a low chuckle, slow and measured, as he tilted his head and looked Shaq up and down, sizing him up. It was the worst mistake he could have made, because Shaq wasn't the kind of man you sized up. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a receding hairline, leaned in toward Wade, his voice low but urgent. "Dude," he whispered, "that's Shaquille O'Neal." Wade didn't react at first. Then he let out another laugh, this one sharper, forced. He waved a dismissive hand. "Yeah, okay, and I'm Michael Jordan." The others hesitated. They weren't so sure anymore. The younger one, the one who had been the most vocal earlier, took a step back. Because now that he looked closer, really looked, he knew. It was him. Wade, still pretending not to care, turned his attention fully to Shaq. His bravado was still there, still clinging to him, but it was weaker now, less certain. "You here to teach me a lesson, big guy?" Wade said, his tone somewhere between sarcasm and a test. "That it?" Shaq didn't react. He simply looked at Wade like he was already done with him. And that, more than anything else, made Wade uncomfortable. The gas station had never been quieter. Not a single beep from the cash register, not the faintest rustle of snack wrappers. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed muted under the weight of what was happening. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of stillness that happens when something shifts. Shaquille O'Neal didn't have to say much. He just stood there. Wade, the leader of the bikers, had spent his life controlling situations like this. He was the kind of man who knew how to tip the scales in his favor, how to use words like knives and laughter like a shield. But this was different. Shaq wasn't playing the game. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even reacting the way Wade expected him to. And that unsettled him more than anything else. The other customers weren't moving either. A woman near the back freezer section had stopped mid-reach, her fingers hovering over a row of energy drinks. A man near the counter, who had been counting change just a moment ago, stood frozen, his hands still gripping the coins. Everyone was waiting. Wade cleared his throat, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up his spine. He forced a smirk, but it didn't come as easily as before. "All right, big guy," he said, spreading his arms in mock surrender. "I don't know what you think's happening here, but you're reading too much into it. We were just having a little fun." Shaq didn't blink, didn't move, didn't give Wade the out he was so desperately searching for. The younger biker, the one who had been grinning earlier, wasn't grinning anymore. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, like he wanted to be anywhere but here. His eyes darted toward Wade, silently asking if they were really going to push this any further. For the first time, doubt crept in. Wade ran a hand through his scruffy beard, letting out a short, dry chuckle. "Look, man," he tried again. "You act like I said something that—" Shaq moved. Not quickly, not aggressively. Just deliberately. He bent down, slowly, his large hands reaching for his mother's bag. His fingers brushed against the leather, gathering the items she had dropped earlier. The simple, careful act of picking up her things made the moment feel even heavier. Then, just as slowly, he straightened and held the bag out to her. "You dropped something," Shaq said, his voice even, steady. That was all. No threats, no anger, no raised voice. And yet, it landed harder than any punch could have. Lucille took the bag, her fingers brushing against her son's hand for the briefest moment. Her expression didn't change, but in her eyes, there was something deeper. Pride. Pride in the way he handled things. Pride in the lesson he was teaching without saying a word. Wade saw it too, and that's what bothered him the most. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of the moment settled over the gas station like an invisible force, pressing down on every person in the room. It wasn't just Shaq's presence that had changed the dynamic. It was the unshakable control he held over it. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a single punch. And yet, the bikers were losing. Wade could feel it like sand slipping through his fingers. The younger bikers were already shifting uneasily. Their shoulders weren't squared like before. Their feet weren't planted as firmly. One of them, a blond man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, looked toward the door. He wasn't thinking about how to win anymore. He was thinking about how to leave. But Wade was a man who had spent his life being the loudest in the room, the biggest presence in any space he walked into. He had built his identity around the idea that no one could put him in his place. And now, in front of his own crew, in front of complete strangers, he was losing control. He couldn't let that happen. So he did what men like him always did when faced with something bigger than them. He laughed. A short, forced chuckle. A sound meant to make it seem like he wasn't affected, like this entire thing was one big joke. "Man, you all are acting like this is serious," Wade said, shaking his head. His voice had lost a little of its previous confidence, but he pushed forward anyway, trying to reclaim the moment. "All this over a little misunderstanding?" Shaq didn't respond. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Wade swallowed, his throat dry. The laughter faded awkwardly, dying in his chest as he realized no one else was laughing. Not his crew, not the cashier behind the counter, not the woman near the refrigerators who had been pretending to check the expiration dates on bottles of iced tea for the past 5 minutes. And certainly not Lucille O'Neal. She stepped forward, her head held high, commanding the kind of respect that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with presence. Her gaze settled on Wade, sharp as glass. "You should be ashamed," she said, her voice steady. Not loud, not angry, just the truth. The words landed heavier than Wade expected. He had spent years throwing insults, breaking people down with his words, turning confidence into dust. But he wasn't used to being on the other end of it. And he sure as hell wasn't used to feeling small. A muscle ticked in his jaw. For the first time, he didn't have a response. One of his own guys, a stocky man with a gray bandana, sighed and ran a hand down his face. "Wade, let's go, man." The younger one, the blonde with the tattoo, had already taken a step toward the door. His mind was made up. He wasn't sticking around. Wade's eyes darted between them, his grip on control slipping more and more by the second. He could feel it unraveling. But before he could try to salvage it, another voice cut through the thick silence. "All right, that's enough." The gas station clerk, the same young man who had been silent this entire time. The same kid who had looked away when Lucille was being harassed. Now, he finally found his voice. His hands were flat on the counter, his face pale but determined. "You need to stop," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "You need to leave." Wade turned, his eyes flashing with something sharp. "Excuse me?" The kid swallowed, but didn't back down. "You heard me." He gestured toward the door. "Take your buddies and go. Now." Shaq said nothing. Did nothing. He just watched. Because this was the real moment of power, not him stepping in. But the moment the people who had been afraid finally stepped up. Wade clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. His entire body was tight with frustration, with the helpless anger of knowing he had already lost. And now, it was just about whether he wanted to drag this out and humiliate himself even further. The blonde biker nudged the door open, stepping out without a word. A second later, the guy in the bandana followed. Wade's stomach twisted. They were really leaving him here, like he was nothing, like he had lost. His fingers curled into fists, his entire body buzzing with the need to do something. Anything, to take the moment back. And then, Shaq finally spoke. "You done?" Simple. Low. A quiet nudge toward the only choice Wade had left. The words dug under his skin, but Wade knew the answer. He knew it the second he realized that even the cashier, the scared kid behind the counter, wasn't afraid of him anymore. He knew it the second he saw Lucille O'Neal looking at him like he was already gone. Wade let out a slow breath, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then finally, he turned and walked out. No parting words, no forced laughter. Nothing. The second the door swung shut behind him, the gas station exhaled. The air, thick with tension just moments ago, suddenly felt lighter. The woman near the drinks finally grabbed a bottle and moved toward the counter. The man counting change relaxed his grip. And the cashier. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Shaq turned to his mother, his expression unreadable. She was already looking at him. He gave her a look. "You okay?" She gave him a look back. "I always am." Shaq smirked, just slightly, as he pulled out his wallet and set a bill on the counter. "Pump 4, he said. The cashier nodded quickly. Yeah, got it." Lucille shook her head, amused, as she walked toward the door. "Always making a scene," she murmured under her breath. Shaq chuckled, following her out. "Wasn't me this time." And with that, they left. The sun was still shining, the world still moving, as if nothing had happened at all. But for the people inside that gas station, everything had changed. Shaquille O'Neal had seen fights before. Real fights. The kind where words didn't matter, where fists did all the talking. But this wasn't one of those fights. This was something far more powerful. A battle of presence. And Wade was losing. Shaq still hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything except exist in the space. But that was enough. More than enough. Because when you're standing in front of a man like Shaq, a man who doesn't need to prove himself to you, that's when you start to question everything. The younger biker with the blonde hair had been the first to break. His earlier confidence had crumbled the second he realized who Shaq was. He wasn't looking for an escape anymore. He was already halfway out the door. He hesitated for just a second, then muttered something under his breath. It was barely audible, but Lucille heard it. "My bad." Not an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing to one he could manage. A crack in the wall of arrogance. Then, without waiting for a response, he left. Just walked out. Didn't look back. Shaq didn't acknowledge him, didn't react, didn't chase that small victory. Because this wasn't about one man. It was about all of them. The second biker, the one with the gray bandana, shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't laughing anymore, wasn't smirking. He was uncomfortable. And Shaq knew why. Because it's one thing to follow a man when he's in control. It's another thing entirely to stand behind him when he's losing it. And Wade was losing it. The confidence, the arrogance, the easy dominance he had walked in with, all of it was crumbling. But he couldn't accept that. Not in front of his guys. Not in front of strangers. So he did what men like him always did when they knew they'd lost but couldn't admit it. He laughed, a forced hollow sound. "Oh, come on," Wade said, shaking his head. "Y'all acting like we did something serious." No one responded. The bandana-wearing biker was already taking a slow step toward the door. Not running, not rushing, just done. And then there was only Wade. Standing there. Alone. His boys had left him. His audience had turned against him. And now, he was just a man standing in the middle of a gas station, trying to pretend he still had power when everyone knew he didn't. Lucille watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head. Not in anger, not even in disgust, just disappointment. That, more than anything, made Wade's throat tighten. He exhaled through his nose, stuffing his hands into his pockets, trying to act like it didn't matter. Then, with a small nod, he walked out. No parting words, no last attempt at control. Nothing. The second the door swung shut behind him, the silence in the gas station stretched, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, the world started moving again. The cashier let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The woman near the drinks grabbed a bottle and walked toward the counter, like she had just remembered why she was there. And Shaq? Shaq just turned to his mother. Lucille glanced up at him, shaking her head again, this time with the smallest hint of amusement. "You didn't even have to say much," she murmured. Shaq smirked. Didn't have to. And with that, they turned and walked out. Back into the sunlight, back into the world, leaving behind nothing but silence and a lesson that no one in that gas station would ever forget. The sun hung lower in the sky now, stretching long shadows across the pavement. The air outside the gas station felt different, lighter, quieter, changed. Lucille O'Neal stood by her car, her back straight, her expression unreadable as she reached into her purse. Her hands moved with the same steady grace they always had. But there was something else now. A quiet understanding. A weight that wasn't there before. Shaq stood beside her, arms crossed, watching her carefully. He had never been the type to overstep where his mother was concerned. Lucille was strong. Always had been. Always would be. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head as she zipped up her purse. "You didn't have to do that," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice wasn't scolding, nor was it relieved. It was just matter of fact. Shaq shrugged, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "You didn't have to do what you did either." He met her gaze, his tone light but firm. "But you did." Lucille didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him, as if seeing him not just as her son, but as a man standing beside her. A protector, even when she didn't ask for it. A beat of silence passed before she finally gave a small, tired chuckle. "Guess we're just stubborn like that," she muttered. Shaq grinned. "Guess so." The sound of hesitant footsteps interrupted them. The gas station clerk, a skinny kid no older than 20, stepped outside, rubbing his hands together nervously. His face was still pale, his fingers fidgeting against his jeans. But there was something else in his expression now. Guilt. Lucille turned to him as he stopped a few feet away, swallowing hard before speaking. I'm sorry," he blurted out. His voice was shaky, but there was sincerity in it. "For not saying anything earlier. I should have..." He hesitated, rubbing his palms together. "I should have done something." Lucille watched him for a moment. Then with a slow nod, she spoke. "You should have." The bluntness of it made the boy stiffen. But she wasn't cruel. She wasn't trying to make him feel small. She was just telling the truth. Shaq didn't say anything, just let the moment stretch. The kid shifted uncomfortably under their gaze, looking down at his sneakers. He exhaled. "I just didn't want any trouble." Shaq finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Trouble found its way here anyway. The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable. The boy nodded, understanding what Shaq really meant. Silence doesn't stop trouble. It lets it grow. Lucille sighed, her expression softening just a little. She had seen men like the bikers her whole life. But she had also seen young men like this, people who wanted to do the right thing, but hesitated when it mattered most. "It's not about what you didn't do today," she said, her voice even. "It's about what you'll do next time." The boy blinked, as if surprised she hadn't just written him off. He nodded again, more certain this time. Yeah, I get that." Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Without a word, he handed the kid a crisp bill. "Pump 4, he said. The clerk hesitated before taking it, but as he did, Shaq extended his other hand. The message was clear. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a lesson, an acknowledgement, a reminder that respect is given, but only if you're willing to earn it. The boy swallowed hard, then shook Shaq's hand, gripping it a little tighter than expected. Shaq nodded once. The kid nodded back. And that was that. Lucille turned toward her car, Shaq following suit. She opened the driver's side door, pausing just long enough to look back at the gas station. The windows reflected the fading sunlight, but inside things weren't the same. The silence wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't hesitation. It was reflection, a shift. The kind of silence that lingers when people know they'll never see things the same way again. Lucille slid into the car, buckling her seatbelt as Shaq climbed into the passenger side. The engine rumbled to life beneath her hands. She glanced at her son. "You always gotta make a statement, huh?" Shaq smirked, stretching his long legs as he leaned back. "I learned from the best." Lucille let out a short laugh, shaking her head. She pulled out of the lot, leaving behind more than just a gas station. They left behind a changed atmosphere. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. The hum of the engine was the only sound for a while, filling the space between mother and son. The tension from the gas station lingered, not as something heavy, but as something unfinished. like a ripple spreading across still water. Shaquille O'Neal stared out of the passenger side window, his thoughts drifting between what had just happened and what it meant. He wasn't angry. He had felt anger before, but this wasn't that. This was something else, something quieter. The kind of knowing that some lessons don't need to be shouted, some fights don't need fists. Beside him, Lucille adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes focused on the road, but her mind clearly elsewhere. Then finally she broke the silence. "You didn't even say much," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. Shaq smirked, shifting in his seat. "Didn't have to." Lucille let out a short chuckle, shaking her head. "Guess not." The truth was, Shaq had learned this lesson a long time ago. People like Wade thrived on reaction. They fed off conflict, built their power on making others feel small. The moment you stepped into their game, you were already playing by their rules. But Shaq hadn't played. He had just stood there, unshaken, immovable. And that had been enough. Because men like Wade could handle yelling. They could handle threats. But what they couldn't handle was being made to feel small without a single blow being thrown. That's what would haunt them. Not fear. Just the knowledge that their power had never been real to begin with. He exhaled, watching the last of the gas station disappear in the side mirror. "Think they'll remember this?" Lucille asked, as if reading his mind. Shaq let the question sit for a moment before answering. "Oh yeah," he said. "They'll remember. Not just the bikers, the clerk, the customers. Everyone who had been inside that gas station had witnessed something shift. The realization that they had been part of a moment that would stay with them forever. For some, it was just a story they'd tell later. For others, it was a wake-up call. And for a select few, it was a mirror held up to the kind of person they had become. Lucille sighed, rolling her shoulders. "People like that don't change easy." Shaq nodded. "Maybe not." He leaned his head back against the seat, staring at the sky. "But now, every time they walk into a gas station and see a woman like you, they'll think twice." Lucille glanced at him, the corners of her lips tugging upward. She wasn't sure if he was right, but she liked the idea. The road stretched ahead, open and endless. Behind them, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the town they had just left behind. They hadn't won a fight. Hadn't needed to. Because victory wasn't about defeating an enemy. It was about changing the game completely. And that? That was the kind of victory that lasted. Some moments stay with you forever. Some lessons change the way you see the world. What would you have done if you were in that gas station? Would you have spoken up or stayed silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the next time life puts you in that moment, your choice will matter.